Anybody have any questions about the form? And again, there's like no best set of values and like no judgment in terms of anyone's value combination. And I definitely don't want to peer pressure anybody to share, but if you found anything insightful, you know, when thinking about your careers and your values, please feel free to share if you would like to. Yeah, please.
So my name is Chanel and my
It just stands up. We're practicing good skills. And
No worries. Hi, everyone. My name is Chanel. Hi. And my top 10 core values are leadership, efficiency, autonomy, tenacity, respect. It should be inspirational. It should have perseverance. It should be freedom. It should have gratitude and responsibility.
Great. And then, what about when you were assessing like your values and your potential career paths? Was there any insights that you gave from that?
In terms of assessing the careers, yeah, they align a lot. Like I want to do emergency specialist for the CDC. So I believe that the freedom, the autonomy, the efficiency and the leadership definitely align with those.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Yes. Of course.
Good morning, everybody. All right, my name is F.A. So in terms of my top 10 core values, the first one was health, family, self-awareness, self-development, discernment, wealth, physical activity, entrepreneurship, perseverance, and then leadership. I only got up to 2 industries where I said health and entrepreneurship.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan.
So warm. Hello. So my 10 core values were humor. Not that funny, but it works sometimes. Never mind.
You got it.
Decisiveness, time in nature, self-realization, collaboration, compassion, creating information, self-respect, self-expression, and wealth, but also worth is important. Top 3 were humor, creating information, and collaboration. So, yeah.
So then, when thinking about your potential career paths, how did your values align?
Right, so I'm actually a graduate student for sustainability program, and I currently work in environmental health and safety. And part of our capstone thesis for the sustainability project is creating a microgrid in West Harlem, actually. So I have some questions. But my focus with that is the social component to sustainability. So it's architecture, it's engineering, but what about the people? So a big part of that is going to be engagement. So we have to create information. It has to be accessible. That has to work a lot of different ways. And humor it works for me, gets to my heart quick. So I think humor will help get that across. And it's going to require collaboration. Nothing is done in a silo. You got to bridge the gaps, interconnect, intersect, all that.
Thank you. I'm one of those folks that has to like sit stand. So if I keep popping up, that's because I have to keep moving. So as you heard, this panel is called Advocacy. So I know that this forum can trigger all kinds of conversations, and what I encourage you to do is take this back, talk to your friends, talk to your mentors, think about this, hold on to this sheet. And for those that are supervisors, use this with your staff also, because it's super helpful in helping people think about their journeys and their process. I would even encourage you to do this a year from now and review this form again. So hold on to this because this will help you think through your advocacy. So we're going to move because I want to make sure that you get to hear these stories. I'm going to ask each of the ladies to give their name and the organization that they're here representing, and one word that describes them around their advocacy spirit.
Now with the paper.
That's right.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is, we gonna entertain y'all the next. My name is Dr. Daniella Thorne. I represent Advocates for You. I am the Associate Director of Sexual Health Education there. And I would say one word to describe my advocacy spirit would be lotus. The lotus flower. The symbolism of it, I encourage you to Google it. So lotus would be my word.
I already introduced myself, so I won't do it again, but I would say my advocacy word is scrappy. Like sometimes I get in groups I'm advocating, I'm like, yeah, I'm very scrappy. Just say it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dawn Minott. I work at the United Nations Population Fund. The acronym is UNFPA, and the acronym does not match up to what it actually is, but just take my word for it. And I would say my word is belonging. Should I explain that? Sure. Okay, so I think a lot of the advocacy work that I do within the space, not just within the UN, but I'll talk a bit about my church environment as well, because it's a big part of who I am and what I do. Creating that sense of belonging, I think is important because you first have to bring people in. It's that call in as opposed to the call out culture that Prof talks so well about. So I think it's important for us to bring people into these conversations when we're advocating for change.
So if I had to pick one word for my advocacy, I would say fierce. Take no prisoners, right? Take no prisoners, yes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about advocacy. And what does advocacy mean to you, Daniella?
Advocacy means to me bringing voices and experiences from the margins to the center, right? Like giving a voice to people, places, even things that typically don't have one. That's what advocacy means to me.
And to me, I would say I agree with all of those things in terms of like amplifying voices of marginalized people. I would also say one big part of my advocacy is accountability, like making people account for injustices and harms that they've done. And yeah, that's big.
I agree with both of you. And I would say, I think today's going to be a lot of ditto between the three of us. But for me, it is about change. And it's change at all levels. So I'm very much interested in change at the individual level, because oftentimes we want to change systems, but systems are designed by, run by, implemented by individuals. So I think it's important to start at the individual level, look at institutional change as well, and then how that swells up into changing our world globally.
Yeah, there you go, y'all. So y'all gonna be change agents by the end of this, for sure. Can you tell us a little bit about where you found your passion? Like, when did your passion for advocacy show up and how did it show up? You want to start?
Okay. Mine showed up very young. I'm a Black woman, as you can see. I was born in Jamaica, as you may hear from my accent, and I grew up in Canada. But in my very young years, I was exposed to both seeing it in my familial context and in the community around me, a lot of violence, and particularly violence against women. And so from a very early age, I was in something bigger than what I understood. I didn't know, I didn't have the words to understand why my community was so volatile, why home was sometimes like that. So from a very early age, I knew I wanted to do something about this thing I didn't understand. And so that desire drove me both in terms of what I would study, both in terms of the kinds of connections I made, because I was always intentional about how am I going to change this level of violence, not just in my community, but especially against women and girls. So very, very young, and it's just been the thing that's been driving me in all of my decisions, whether it be for my friendships, my career, where I hang out, that's always in the back of my mind. How am I going to change that in our society?
So I would say my advocacy didn't really start until I finished graduate school. And I think some of this was really because I had to find myself in a place where I felt secure to then really do advocacy. And then also to have the confidence to actually share anything about my personal life, which drove a lot of my advocacy. So I first stepped into advocacy around teaching coding to incarcerated individuals. And this really came from, my father was incarcerated from all my high school years through my undergrad years. And so it was something I was always really passionate about. But I was always like really kind of shy and in some ways ashamed to really share with my colleagues about my personal background. But then once I got my postdoc and I was like a very prestigious postdoc position, I was like, oh, well, now I felt like secure enough to be able to like out my background. And then I started teaching coding to incarcerated men in San Quentin prison. And I learned so much from that. And it really helped me to also process through some of my own trauma to be able to become an advocate. And so, yeah, that was the start for me.
It's interesting because I think I fell into it. I've always been a contrarian, so I've always been like, well, why have we got to do it that way? And I think I've always been interested in reproductive health, sexual health, and I got introduced to it in undergraduate doing teen pregnancy prevention among Latina women in Albany, New York. And that was more programmatic, but always being interested in like, how do we prevent this? I've always been curious about this idea that like Black and brown girls are just at risk. Just what does that even like, what does that even mean? And like says who? And so again, contrarian, right? Always asking questions. And so I kind of fell into advocacy and really wanting to understand what makes someone at risk and what are the reasons why people are saying they're at risk and how are the systems perpetuating that risk, that perceived risk of teen pregnancy, STI contraction, et cetera.
So we have some risk takers.
Yeah.
So I know from the panel earlier this morning, we raised that whole conversation about risk and advocacy can be a bit risky. So I know that question isn't on the paper. She didn't say I had to follow all the questions.
It was suggestion.
It was suggestion.
You're right.
But I think folks would like to know, in your advocacy life, the risk, where does it and how do you process that? Because as women of color, you sit in these very high-powered, unique positions where advocacy is built into your titles, into the work. Can you talk a little bit about how you process that from an advocacy spirit?
That's so good. So my work really looks like advocating for sexual reproductive health education, inclusive sexual reproductive health education in school-based. And so through K through 12, and you can imagine in this political climate, it is a very colorful job to do, particularly because I support school districts throughout the country. And I think the pros outweigh the risks because I think of how many young people can be affected and how not having adequate human growth and development education, sexual reproductive health education can impact every single aspect of their life throughout their life course. I think the cons of them not having that access outweighs me being this tall Black woman coming in like, this is wrong. Abstinence only is not working. They are having sex, and like, oh, you don't think that you have LGBTQ youth in your classroom? They're here. They just perhaps don't feel safe enough to come out yet. And I think, when you're talking to educators, data is really important. And so it's like finding the way to bridge the gap and saying like, hey, your graduation rates are saying that something is not right. Your teen pregnancy rates are saying that something is not right. Your sexual violence among your young people, your sexting, all of those things are showing that your young people need information that they're not getting. That keeps me motivated, that keeps me energized. And I think the pros of knowing what the results can be of that outweigh the risk of me going into these spaces that oftentimes I'm not welcome. Particularly when I first came into this work, I did it in Georgia. For South correct. And like here I am, right? This and I had natural hair, so it was very vivacious. This girl from Brooklyn, like, hey, I want to do sexual reproductive health education in like rural Georgia, where I'm driving amongst cotton fields. And they're like, well, now somebody send this girl back up to where she came from. But again, knowing that like in 2014, we're still teaching about abstinence. Like, come on, y'all, right? And so that revitalizes me, that pushes me, because I know that there is a young person that is gonna learn about how to effectively use a condom that could literally save their lives. So that's what's important to me.
Let's see, what should I say? The question was about risk. So I will say, you know, our ability to take risks and how that actually impacts us can totally differ depending on your career stage and then like where you're at as a person. The job that I do now, I could not have done 10 years ago. I wasn't emotionally, I would say about 5 years ago, I wasn't emotionally mature enough for it. I was too risk averse in terms of like, you know, caring about my own personal kind of job security and things like that. But there can be a point in your life where, you know, just things flip. And for me, I kind of reached a point where I am totally happy to make other people uncomfortable. Most of my job involves me talking to people that are in positions of power, whether this be like at Congress, whether it be, you know, our US negotiators that are in charge of like UN treaties or whatever, and talk about racism, talk about what they're not doing well. And, you know, even like I said, the word scrappy, because try to, you know, convince them that we can hold you to account, like people that are perceived as not very powerful. And I think for me, I really, once I started to become older and a little bit more mature, I realized that I, you know, also come from a legacy of people that have really done this. So from my mom's side, I come from a family of farm workers from the Salinas Valley in California, and from my dad's side, like all Chicanos from LA. So we have, you know, my family's been part of the farm workers movement, the civil rights movement in Southern California. And I realized like, wow, if I had, you know, relatives that were standing up when they didn't have these titles, they were way more marginalized than I am in my position right now. And they were doing like really big things that made me feel very empowered that I could use, you know, my platform that I have. And so that's just all to say that at some points in your life, you might have an advocacy opportunity, but it might feel too risky for you. And that's okay, because that doesn't mean you need to do it then. There might be another time where it fits for you, because you being sustained and protected and is really important for the long run. And so don't always feel like you have to take major risks.
Yeah. Wow, I love this panel. You know, I think I'd say being grounded in my why has really helped to measure the risk. Because every time I think, okay, Dawn, that might be too risky, I think, but why are you doing this? And I like what you said just now, because I also have to measure that, and you have to measure that against your self-care as well, right? So yes, you want to take the risk, but what does it mean for you personally? So you got to measure that why against the risk and against, you know, you taking care of yourself. So I work in the area of ending violence against women and girls and in gender equality. Those are like staring the, you know, the patriarchy in the face and be like, you know, suck it. Like you're really tearing down barriers in the work that I do. And so you're always at risk. I was saying privately to our panel just now that most oftentimes when I sit on a panel, I am the one only woman, and definitely the only Black woman. So the patriarchy, even within the system that I work in, is very, very strong. So it's always risky when you're speaking out against what has come to be known as the norm, right? Because as feminists and as gender equality specialists and women and others who are working against ending violence against women, we are going up against what is the norm in our society and saying that violence is a learned behavior, therefore it can be unlearned. And there's no room for normalizing, which is what's happening now. Our society is normalizing violence, in particular violence against women. So I'm always knocking against those doors and saying, no, we can actually end violence. And so part of the work of UNFPA, we've got 3 transformative results. And by 2030, 7 years from now, and one of that result is to end violence against women and girls and all harmful practices like child marriage, like female genital mutilation, 7 years from now. And I'm still aspirational about that and still taking risks to make that happen because like I said, if you learn this behavior, you can unlearn this behavior. So again, my why is always driving me. Dawn, why are you knocking against these doors? Because I really do believe that our society can be better if we have safe spaces at home, safe spaces in our community, in our schools, in our churches, and in our world globally. So that's kind of how I manage my why against my risks.
There you go. So advocacy and risk. We heard a little bit about what happens in your professional life, but how do you balance advocacy and risk in the rest of your life, sitting in these roles? Because I think it's important. These women wear multiple hats all the time. Can you just share a little bit about how you sit in that space of advocacy and risk outside of your role? We're doing like. Daniella, you want to start?
No, thank I'm happy to start. I would say that I am like the ultimate code switcher. Like I can move through all kinds of different spaces, wearing all kinds of different masks, and that's for self-protection. And you know, that's a skill set that has become very important for me as like an advocate, scientist. I mentioned earlier that I'm a rapper. I
love that, by the way.
I don't let, not
Should have
everything is for
something there.
everybody. It's
Yeah.
like my thing. And that's one thing I always tell my mentees, like, you don't have to share everything with everybody because that's very risky. And so feel, you know, entitled to protecting yourself and your privacy. And especially for those of you that are public health advocates of color, like you will have many times in your career where people try to pull everything from you and just feel entitled to be able to protect your own space, not share it all the time.
There you go, yeah.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, I've been advocating for this long before I had the words and the knowledge on how to advocate. So I've been carrying this thing for a long time. But I'm also very artistic. I love to write. I love words. Like you, the artistic side of me kind of got laid to the side because I had to pursue a career. As a Jamaican, maybe even as a woman of African descent, because all of us, when I say this, who are African descent will understand this. You will be a lawyer, a doctor, and if you didn't get there, maybe an engineer would be okay. So I was gonna be my family's lawyer, and you can relate, can't you? I was gonna be my family's lawyer and got to university and got into this course on gender studies. Actually, it was called women's studies back then. Called home to Jamaica, told my mom I'm switching from law to go do women's studies. And she's like, you're a woman. Like, so I kind of got into this very, very early, but I also realized that it's an artistic side of me that kept pulling at me. So like you, Terry, I signed up for a PhD in this whole gender thing. And then I signed up for architectural school. And I was like, I love them both. Whichever one comes through first, that's where I'll go. And grad school came through first. I went to grad school, but the art side of me just kept pulling at me. And what that has done is given me a safe space. When I can't deal with all of the stuff that I have to keep in my head, you know, measure against how safe it is to speak out in this space, I write a poem about it. At first, it was a journal that I just kept locked away because they were my thoughts, they were the place to keep me safe. And I encourage you to write stuff down. And you don't have to always go public with it, right? It's just your way of getting it out of your system, you write it down. My journal turned into a whole collection of poems. And under COVID, I'm like, what am I gonna do with all of this stuff? I kept writing and writing and I started a blog. And so that's me putting out there what I want to put out there at the time when I think it's important to go out there. So I'm still using my advocacy in that way, but bringing my creativity to it. And I think all of us are creative. All of you are creative in your own ways. And if you can tap into that creativity, it's a good way to balance whatever it is that your advocacy issue is, balance that with your creativity as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will answer.
Mhm.
So I was really like taking in the responses. I think I don't have, the original question was, can you repeat the question?
How do you put metrics? How do you right?
In my personal life. So I think I show up the same exact way in all areas of my life. Perhaps that's a strength and a weakness to be determined. And so I'm grateful that my current employer has created a space where I can do that comfortably, right? At previous employers, although, yeah, we were advocating for sex ed, we couldn't talk about abortion. We would be okay with abstinence plus. Whereas now, with my employer, I think that I'm able to really walk in all the things that I value and advocate for all the things that are important to me, whether that's personally or professionally. And so that creates a space where I'm not apprehensive about what I'm posting on my Instagram because somebody might associate me with another organization. And so I'm grateful for having that autonomy.
I'm glad you raised that because advocacy based on your paycheck can look very different than when you do in your personal life. And I think sometimes you have to really think through the risk of, especially in this time and age of social media where everything is recorded, everything is for a longer period of time and shows up. So it's something to think about. I know it took me a while to get to that place of balancing my advocacy and risk. By trade, I'm a clinical psychiatric social worker who happens to do public health. So, yeah, it can be a bit risky because you're talking about rights and autonomy, and you may have family members who don't always align with what your speak is. And you got to find a place of comfort.
Can I just pick up a little bit? Because what you were saying just now made me think about how do we bring our whole selves to everything that we do, right? Because sometimes you want to compartmentalize. I can't be black, code switch, I can't be black enough today, right? So how do we really in our advocacy and in keeping ourselves safe, how do we bring our whole selves to this work? And I think a part of my journey has been how to discover how to do that, right? So I absolutely agree with you. You see me at church, you see me at work, it's the same dawn. But I do know when to tone a little bit of that down because I'm not going to walk into my church and talk about feminist, right? Like it's just not going to land very well in a church setting. But I can use days like International Women's Day to talk about these issues in a way that the church is receptive to it. So I bring my work into church. And at work, my colleagues will tell you if they want to have a place for a safe conversation, they're knocking at my door. I'm not going to say Jesus or Muhammad or whoever God it is that you serve, but I am going to speak about what spirituality means for me to encourage others. So I bring my church self to work as well. So I think it's very important to find who you are in all spaces and find safe ways to bring that in. So you're not living your life in compartmentalized ways, but your whole self is always there.
Gotcha. Are y'all getting these little tidbits here, right? Oh, okay. We'll make sure that we're. So ladies, as women of color, what unique experiences or challenges have you faced in your profession or your professional being? So what challenges?
Okay. I thought we was going to.
I'm
All right.
looking at you first.
Okay, that's fine. I will say that the sex ed space is very white. It's very white, female, and the challenge, I think I faced the more challenges while pursuing the doctorate in South Georgia and trying to, I did my research around adolescence. And so focus groups with adolescents and finding ways to have conversations with adolescents about
humility at this stage in my life that I didn't always have. And so I check, I feel like I don't have as much of an ego as I used to. Like, I don't even have to check it at the door. I feel like, I'm like, whatever, people disrespect me all the time, and I'm like, I can't be bothered. And so, yeah, I mean, so many times I go into advocacy meetings. Just the other day, I was meeting with the head from the EPA, like talking about a research project, and they're like, well, are you gonna consult any researchers? And I was like, I am a researcher. Like,
I am the
like,
PI.
yeah, exactly. I get disrespected all the time, but I don't care, because like the work is so important. So I think humility is a big one for me.
So I come to public health from a social science background. My career chose me in many ways, because like I said, I was gonna be the lawyer, right? So I think understanding human behavior, and I bring that from my social science training into this work. And I'll give you just one example of how important this is in my area of work. I was the head of office in northern Nigeria, in Kaduna. You can't get more violent than Kaduna, Boko Haram and the likes. And I was meeting with, commissioners and ministers of health to have conversations around why girls' education is important in a part of Nigeria that is about 90% Muslim, where girls are pulled out of school earlier, not just to be put out of school, but to get married. And as soon as they're married, they start having children. So I was advocating on why this should not continue to be the case. And I went with a male, because I knew this beforehand, having, the cultural awareness that's done before you go on these kinds of work assignments. So I had a male counterpart with me. So I would talk to the male minister or commissioner, and I would look at him, and then he would look at my male partner to respond. And this conversation went on for an hour just like that. So understanding human behavior is important, because and culture as well, but not understanding that, then you misinterpret, right, what is being done to you as a woman. And really that wasn't it. It was, as a Muslim, he's not going to have more than a 30-second, if that long, extended stare at a woman. So I think understanding, that and moderating your behavior based on the context that you find yourself in, I think is very important as well. And the final thing I'll say is on, again, from my social science background, is I have to be very analytical. And I work in very complex context, ending violence against women, human rights abuses, very complex issues. So you have to really be able to analyze and use that as part of your advocacy as well.
Can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
Because I think that analytical nature is really important, and like emotional regulation, because I think that that's also comes through in that example. And I found that to be really important, and also being patient to like long game things, because I think that so much of this work is a long game.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I also heard was that sometimes you're not always the right messenger for the message. So you have to know your audience, and you have to know who can convey that message. And as an advocate, sometimes you're not the one that's in the front of the room. If you're working with a faith community, you may need a faith leader to deliver that message to other faith leaders. If you're talking to an all-male cohort, they may not hear one thing you're saying as a woman, but you may need to sometimes bring in your allies, your team, so that they can then convey that message. And that's okay, because that is advocacy. Advocacy shows up in lots of different ways. And I guess one of the things that we want to leave you with is that stand in your space, because your advocacy will look different every day, depending on where you're standing or sitting at the moment and who you're standing and sitting with. So, ladies, I thank you. I'm going to open the floor for questions, if that's okay with you. Is there anything that you want to say before we open the floor for questions? Let me make sure that you have dropped whatever pearls you want to drop for the moment, or you want to hold that. Yeah, okay. So, questions? Oh. Like, boom. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy, and I'm currently a grad student at CUNY SPH. First of all, I really acknowledge all three of you for like the courage, authenticity, and self-expression that's making the public health better. Well, way good, better. I want to start. I'm feeling I'm feeling very limited by being an international student from India, where I have like very much passionate about like helping people and like, creating a difference in the community, contributing into people's lives. And so I find it very difficult into like applying for jobs and just because every job or a public health organization I apply to, it'll say, look, we have to be a US citizen. And if I go back to India, public health is not even a thing, because my own family, they don't understand what I'm studying right now. So what would you recommend me and other international students, of course, to like continue in this path, because I'm shaving right now.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for sharing that.
I don't think I'm the
It's a
best
hundred
person to
percent
address that.
Dawn? Terry? I'm gonna look to wait. I'm looking to my dean back here.
I I can share because I was an international student myself, so just personally, I can, I just want to commend you for being bold and being vulnerable, because I see your vulnerability shining through right now, and that's a powerful thing. One of the women that I love in this space is Brene Brown, and she talks a lot about vulnerability. I'm going to share a quote with you afterwards about that. So I want to applaud you for being transparent and being vulnerable in this space. And I believe that's because you feel like this is a safe space for you to do that. So kudos to you, my sister. So just from a personal point of view, as a young Black girl, I finished up high school in Canada. So I do understand how difficult it is to navigate that space. So, everything that you can do in terms of your own self-care and protecting yourself, I think is important, because you're in a space that's very different than what you know from home. You're studying a field that your parents don't understand. My mom had no idea why I'm doing what I'm doing either, but still push for it, because again, if you know your why, all the risk that comes up against that will help you to remember, okay, this is why I'm doing this thing. Nancy, right? This is why I'm doing this thing, and everything that comes up against you, your why is going to keep you grounded, and of course, keep yourself safe in the process. I can't speak to how you actually get to work in the US, and maybe that's something the school can figure out with you. But I remember when I was in university, the career department of my school had positions just for international students to give us a chance to work in contexts where we can work based on our visa requirements and so on. So that's something you can explore with the university, see how best you can do that.
Okay. We will definitely connect you with Hannah after this. And thank you for sharing that. Your position will come. It's just a matter of time in the right position. That's
It's just always the clock is ticking.
Yes,
Like, the
totally.
visas and permission and everything. It's like, okay, one thing is over and now
There's
next thing's
something else.
deadline is coming up.
Yeah.
So-
And one
So, yes.
I just wanted to add to that, because I think for the majority of you here are PhDs, correct? So, the reason I went and got a PhD was because PhDs are free. Like, you get paid to get your PhD. And I have so many international colleagues that did their PhDs. Usually after that, you're able to postdoc on a J1 visa in the United States. And, after that, oftentimes, because then you have your PhD, it's easier to get those sponsorships. So sometimes when we're thinking about our educational track, thinking about your life, and like for you in this case, being in the United States, sometimes there are also economic factors that come into play, can actually really guide you to make strategic decisions. And I oftentimes, with my mentees, if they're coming from economically vulnerable backgrounds, I oftentimes have really serious conversations with them about what bachelor's they're getting, what masters they're getting, if they're gonna get a master's, or, needing to skip it, because sometimes those life things are really important, and thinking about those sources of stress and trying to minimize them. So, if you haven't considered a PhD, then you won't get paid super well, but you won't be paying for it. So that's also something to consider.
Thank you. Okay, did you?
First, I want to thank you for sharing that, Nancy. So my first question is, or first, let me just say, I work at the Borough of Manhattan Community College as a healthcare industry specialist. So a lot of my work is actually working with employers and doing a lot of advocacy, because I actually have students or international students, getting them opportunities. I actually have one of my top students here who's a public health student here, and because he's very quiet. I just want to talk about it. He's one of our top students. So this is a question actually pertaining to him, where what were their habits and mindset that you consistently did that you felt strongly helped you be in the position you're currently at, especially in your early years of your professional career?
Don't procrastinate. I think
I would have to go back to what I said before, know your why. Yeah. I think once you know exactly what it is that you want to achieve, it's very difficult to get derailed.
Yes.
And you really have to be settled. Can I just tell you? So I got into the PhD program. My desire for my PhD was to be called Dr. Dawn. And that is not going to sustain you.
All right, everybody all at the same time.
Dr. That is not gonna sustain you through a PhD, so of course I did not continue. But my why was so strong that when my first, I did an internship with the UN as I got into the UN. And my first boss said to me, Dawn, you don't need a PhD. What you need to do is to get into UNFPA, the UN Population Fund. And because my why was very clear, right? And that organization could help me to get to my why. So I would think that would be, I think, a tip as well for you.
I agree with that.
So ladies and gentlemen and everyone else in between, our time is ticking. So I want to give our panelists the opportunity to give us their summation, their last thoughts, their last shipments.
I guess so. I would say, well, firstly, shout out to the school for hosting this type of event. I wish something like this existed when I probably would have. Yeah, shout out to you all for coming to this and just learning and getting information. Advocacy is great work, but it's hard work. And I would say that you want to always make sure you take care of yourself in any way, shape, or form. You cannot be of service to others if you're not taking care of yourself. And a lot of the time, these things that we're passionate about can deplete us because the world around us is already just troubling. Yeah. That is the adjective that I'm going to use for today. And so I encourage you to find your passion, find your why, but also take care of yourself often.
And I agree about knowing the why. And I was joking, but not joking when I said don't procrastinate. I think that doing things with intention is like really important. And if you're able to do things with intention, then, you know, easily do it with intention, not pushing yourself too hard, then you kind of know you're on the right path. If you feel like you're always having to force yourself to like, you know, do something, then it might not be the best path for you. So I usually use that as a gauge for like, oh, is this really something I want to be doing? And yeah, just when you show up, like let people know you're there.
Yeah, I agree. Let people know that you're there. I specifically brought quotes for you because I wanted to leave with you some of the quotes that drive me through the tough days.
Come on, Dr. Thorne.
Well, now. And they happen to all be from Brené Brown. But in hindsight, I should have pulled one from Bell Hooks, her book on love, because I'm reading that right now and I'm like,
So good.
it is so good. It is so
Bell
good.
Hooks.
Bell Hooks.
If you haven't read it, read it.
Please read it. It is so, so good. So, so good. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. Brené Brown. Daring greatly means the courage to be vulnerable. It means to show up and be seen, to ask for what you need, to talk about how you're feeling, to have the hard conversations. Brené Brown. Courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen. And finally, true belonging doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are.
Right now. So one more, and that is to remember to be forward focused and not past possessed. Be the best advocate you can be. You have all been now certified advocates, change agents. You can put that on your LinkedIn. That is now your new title. Thank you all for taking the time and thank you for being with us. You're more than welcome to go back downstairs for the